Future Sense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nick Jeans and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, Future Sense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is Future Sense.
Here we are, tuned to Future Sense with myself, Nick Jeans, and my co-host, futurist Steve McDonald. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Nick.
And our good friend is back in the chair over here, Mitch Schultz, the Texan elf. Good morning, Mitch.
Good morning, gentlemen. Great to be back.
So nice to have you back here. Wonderful. And we're launching into the new year. This is our second show of the new year, having missed last week because we were out at Uluru, the three of us, and a whole bunch of other people. We'll be talking a little bit about that today because we'll be focusing a little bit on, Steve, what are we focusing on today?
Let me check my notes. It's
Finally, he's going to tell us.
We're going to talk about the rebirth of Indigenous knowledge and relate it back to Graves' research, which looks at recurring themes in second-tier consciousness. So as we move into second tier, it's like the recurrence of the kind of Indigenous living that we saw at the beginning of the first tier, but in a different octave, I guess is one way to say it. And also, we're going to talk later in the show, or in the second podcast out of this morning's show, about the need for adaptation to climate change. So first up, we're going to talk about the rebirth of Indigenous knowledge this morning, and this has been in the news a little lately here in Australia, of course, with the unusually large and wildfires that we've had here over the last month or two, and a lot of people talking about Indigenous fire knowledge and Indigenous management of the fire risk.
It's one of the few positives that have come about from the tragedies of the fires here is this focus on Indigenous knowledge and the success already of some people, some farmers and some landholders using some Indigenous practices to stave off some of the worst of the fires. It's been fantastic.
Yeah. And it fits in with Graves' research in a very interesting way. Graves talks about the emergence of second-tier consciousness, which starts with the seventh layer, and that's been tagged yellow in the Spiral Dynamics book, and Graves called it intuitive. It's driven by the emergence of this second tier of human consciousness is driven by extreme challenges which we need to face, compounding issues on a global scale, which are beyond the capacity of first tier human consciousness to resolve. And so what we're seeing with the recent fires in Australia is an early stage emergence of some extreme challenge that needs to be solved. And as Graves was analysing his data, he got a team of 7 peers together whom he called his judges, and he used to throw his data from his field research at them and ask them to sort it in whatever way they could figure. And so interestingly, it wasn't him who actually came up with the discrete layers in that way. It was his judges. He just gave them the raw data and said, see how you can sort this stuff in a way that makes sense. And what happened was, after he had amassed a good amount of data, and they'd identified the first 6 layers plus this 7th layer, which was really a quantum leap ahead of the other layers. After a while, the people who had been identified as operating through this 7th layer of consciousness actually changed, and that kind of threw Graves for a while. He didn't know what to do with them, and he wondered at first if there was an error in his data, and so he took notice of the judges saying, okay, these people have changed into something that looks different. It's a different value system again. And at that stage in history, there was no model of human consciousness around that had any more than 7 stages in it. So it just didn't seem to fit. And Graves went back over his data and tried to figure out what was going on there and whether there was just in fact an error somewhere. And what he found was, as he was looking back over his data, that the people who were operating from layer 7, if he had to try and compare them to one of the previous layers, they were most like layer 1, which represents indigenous hunter-gatherer type existence, which is, very, very much connected with nature and living in harmony with nature. And then on realising that, he looked at what these people had changed into, which became the 8th layer of his model eventually, and he realised that 8th layer was most like layer 2, which was the traditional tribal layer. So that gave him the idea that, okay, maybe I'm dealing with recurring sets or patterns here, and the themes of the first layer, or the first tier of consciousness rather, repeat in the second tier. And that was the sort of understanding that he finally settled on, although he was very clear to say that he didn't really get enough data on that 8th layer to describe it in any detail. Yeah, I think he only had 6 people out of 1,065 that he studied who showed up in that 8th layer of consciousness, which was the most complex. So that's really interesting. And of course, in a way, his model is a predictive model that's giving us, early vision of the future of humanity, which is slowly evolving in response to increasing complexity of life conditions. And here we are now, decades later, actually starting to see this emerge in real life, which is pretty exciting stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, what we're talking about here is not a circular thing or a circular repetition, but a spiralic resonance of one layer to the next.
Yeah,
and that's really important, because we're not going around repeating ourselves in the same way.
No, but you can see how some people might interpret it that way, because with recurring themes, it does look, depending on your perspective, like we're going back to the old ways. But in fact, we're sort of discovering a second octave if you wanted to relate it to like a musical theme. So it's the same note, but it's the next octave up on a different vibration. So not exactly the same, but definitely similar. And if we look back then and we think about these first 2 layers in the first tier, so the basic hunter-gatherer and traditional tribal, and we think about the way that they lived, you might be able to describe it as, for example, being deeply connected to the earth and all life on the earth and the terrain itself. Having a deep knowledge of and working very, very closely with the energy of the earth, which has been described in many, many different ways as we've evolved through the other layers. Some people call it ley lines,
dragon lines, song lines in Australia, and many others. And the interesting thing is, so many traditions of these peoples have similar concepts one way or the other.
Exactly, it's found all over the world.
Yes.
And back in those early first tier layers, we had, because there was nothing to do at night time except look at the stars mainly.
No TV with that. Mitch, that wouldn't do well for you and me, would it? No, no Netflix, couldn't it?
Well, they had very widescreen, good definition sky though, which is pretty amazing. That we don't. Most people don't see these days because they live in cities where the lights block out the sky, right? Yeah. So incredible knowledge of the stars, which has accumulated over tens of thousands of years, and the subtle changes occurring. I mean, even things like the precession of the equinoxes was recorded, which is a kind of a 26,000 year cycle. And all of the things that are associated with that, like the seasons on the planet, the weather, the climate cycles, all of those sorts of things. And many of these old traditions have still to this day preserved knowledge of unusual astronomical activities like supernovas and those sorts of things. I think there's a story I mentioned before on the show about a 30,000-year-old event which was and still is recorded in oral history in Australia's Aboriginal culture. And also, I know in other cultures overseas there are records, like oral records of ice ages, glaciers retreating and reforming and all these sorts of things, things that go way beyond. And Nick's just holding up Freddie Silver's latest book, The Missing Lands, which we've mentioned before too, which is a really, really wonderful compilation of a whole lot of information from right around the world, which starts to make sense of some of the advanced knowledge which existed a long, long time ago. Also, superior sensory awareness, so having to literally live off the senses and having extraordinary powers of observation and analysis, within nature that you wouldn't see in most urban folks these days.
Of course, we see that so much in, for example, Aboriginal trackers in this country and many other countries to be able to read the landscape in a way that us white fellas simply just cannot see that stuff.
Yeah, that's right. And interestingly, some of this knowledge is preserved in the military these days.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons I was strongly attracted to being in the military was because of my Indigenous heritage. I loved playing in the bush when I was a kid, and the idea that I could do that, as a job and live and work in the bush was pretty attractive to me. So working with nature, living embedded in nature, which we don't do so much these days, being custodians of the land, like having a sense of being there to care for the
caretakers.
Land. The whole idea of having a totem animal or creature within a particular area meant that within that area, that particular creature was protected. It wasn't hunted, it wasn't eaten. And when you get that kind of diversity spread over a large area, it's an incredible way of managing the wildlife and sustaining it, and caring and working with the land in a regenerative way. And part of that, of course, was the traditional burning of the land, and over time, many species in Australia, many plant species, actually adapted themselves to regular burning, and so in some species, I believe they won't actually regenerate unless they're burnt.
Yes.
And the other interesting thing about Indigenous life is this multi-dimensional awareness, so the embedding of spirituality as an everyday concept, and communication with other dimensions as being an everyday thing. It's just a regular thing, It's not some weird left field thing like it has become in today's somewhat disconnected society.
Yes, dreams and visions mean something, and they actually have a character. They have a resonance with the earth, with the stars, with everything. Somehow, everything is connected in a way that we lost a long time ago along the way as we've become more and more materialist, if you will.
Yeah. And so you can, looking back at human history, you can see through various major events like the agricultural revolution and the scientific industrial revolutions how we've really, really changed the way that we live and relate to nature.
Yeah.
And to some extent have isolated ourselves, I guess you might say protected ourselves from nature, and ended up living in cities and those sorts of things, and consequently lost track of a whole lot of that information.
And using and abusing the resources of nature rather than being in a relationship, as you're speaking of caretaker and taking only what you need. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So what Graves's model is telling us is that this shift into second tier, which is going to be and is being currently driven by extreme evolutionary tension, very, very large wicked problems, as Monica called it in the Change Code book. And the only way that we're going to resolve those problems is through this huge shift in consciousness, which is going to take us back to a higher octave version of that Indigenous relationship with the land.
It's very exciting, and of course that reclamation of that space inside ourselves, or inside our psyche, where it's a landscape in our psyche that we're sort of rediscovering, I guess, in a way, for many people, is in a way, given the troubles that we have on the planet, the problems that we are facing, is a really necessary aspect of those coming solutions, it would seem.
Yeah, exactly. So we just went to Uluru, and in one aspect of that was exploration of this second octave Indigenous relating to natural energies in the land. So in that sense, it was, I guess, a experimental adventurous excursion by us, and we took a team of 15 of us out there.
Well, there was 16 actually, because there was a baby as well.
Oh, there was actually a baby Rowan. I forgot about baby Rowan.
And it was 8 men and 8 women in the end, which was extraordinary. That it ended up, if you include the baby, it was 8 men. If you didn't, it was 8 men and 7 women.
That's right.
And Mitch, it was first time out there for you, just quickly too, just to bring you into the conversation.
Absolutely amazing. Yeah. Blown away by not just the rock itself, but the space that energetically what was being kind of brought about, and I think we all felt that in many different ways, but it was absolutely amazing to be out there.
Fantastic.
Indeed, and if we look back to the Indigenous way of living from layers 1 or 2, then from a mainstream, particularly a scientific industrial perspective, a lot of what they would claim and how they would explain their interaction with nature, and particularly their multidimensional communication, would be poo-pooed and discarded as unbelievable, ridiculous fantasy, primitive, overly simplistic. Yet here we are, as we move into second tier, we're moving to what is technically called a trans-rational way of being, which is beyond the rational mind's control. And so we are actually going back to, in a sense, this opening up to multidimensional input, and yet it's more sophisticated than the scientific, industrial, rational-minded understanding of reality. This is a difficult topic to talk about because those who are still very much operating according to the dominance of the rational mind will find some of the things that we're going to discuss ridiculous, perhaps unbelievable, and maybe usually what happens is when people operating from, say, layer 5 or even layer 6 encounter this kind of thing, because they literally cannot conceptualize transrational operation, they will categorize it as pre-rational, and so it's seen as simplistic, childlike. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that. There's quite likely that some of the stuff that we're going to discuss on this show is going to be interpreted that way for some people, but that's the way it is.
Which is interesting for me, because you were talking about graves earlier and seeing these recurring themes, probably operating from 5, 6, possibly, I don't know exactly, but being able to start seeing these recurring patterns and then having these others be able to kind of tease that out a little bit is pretty amazing and thoughtful. Yeah,
it is amazing. I mean, I'm pretty sure that Graves was at least poking at a second tier. Otherwise, I don't think he would have been able to conceptualize the model as he did. Yeah, very interesting.
What we said before, I think, about Graves, and for those podcast listeners, you know what we're talking about. For those relatively new listeners, we might, when we come back after our first break, we might just give a very brief summary of Graves's work just again. This book.
We've got a copy of the change code to give away today. Is the text line working?
The text line is working now, so great. You can communicate either on the text line if you are a subscriber to Bay FM to go in the draw for that book, or you can call us on 66807 999. Kate is out there, she will take your call. The text line is 0437341119. And why we are talking about holding up the book, it's because we are actually filming today. Mitch, just give us a bit of an overview of what we're doing here and what we're beginning with this year, with you here for a beginning, now with visuals here on this Future Sense show.
Our trip out to Uluru inspired us to go look at some new technology, and we got ourselves a new little toy to play with, our GoPro Max, but what we want to do is start recording these and putting these out in 360 so we can kind of engage the viewers a little bit more and start pulling in more visual aspect to what we're doing. So
trying to get as many perspectives included as possible.
Right. Fantastic. Yeah.
You can check us out in 360, folks.
Yeah. So we'll let you know how to do all of that as we go forward very shortly. So we're in a bit of an experimental stage today, and being 2020, all bets are off. I think paradoxes abound. Unusual and uncertain circumstances are probably going to happen more often. I think that's personal and societal, and clearly on the planet, everything is pretty shaky, inside and outside, and we're here to help. We're a bit of a triage here, you could say. We'll take a break, yeah?
Yep.
Here on Bay FM.
You're tuned to Future Sense with Nick Jeans and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up.
You're tuned now to Future Sense with myself, Nick Jeans, Steve McDonald, and our special guest, the great Mitch Schultz. The great Mitch Schultz.
I like the Texan elf.
Yeah, the Texan elf, indeed. And we're talking about Indigenous wisdom, essentially, and we base much of what we talk about on the show, as you do know if you're a regular listener, on Clare W. Graves' work, who was a psychologist in the 50s, 60s, 70s, died in 1986 in the US, and the research that he did, which Steve articulated early in the show, just so that you know that. But most of you who listen to the show regularly know that, and also our podcast listeners out there, hello to you.
And of course, all that stuff is wonderfully summarised in the Change Code book, which we're giving a copy away of today.
Indeed, there it is again for those who can see it visually.
And a shout out to Monica Bourgeot, the author of that book, who's one of our regular listeners, we know.
Indeed.
So we've just been talking about the recurrence of Indigenous themes in second-tier consciousness and how the traditional ways of living that we saw mostly, which were common at earlier times in history, although there are still many people on the planet who are living according to those value systems. And Graves found in his research that as we moved into second tier, which is like a second octave or a second chapter of human existence, that there was a recurrence of themes, apparently, at least in the first two layers 7 and layers 8. And he made an assumption at the time that maybe there's another set of 6 coming, just like the first 6 layers in the first tier, but we still don't really know that for sure yet. And so what does this higher octave emergence of Indigenous themes look like? So I guess earlier in the show, I went through a quick list of some of the characteristics of the original Indigenous groups of people who are living on the planet, and I'll just quickly whip through those again. So being deeply connected to the earth, plants and all life, and the physical terrain itself, knowledge of the terrain, working with energy lines, geomagnetic fields, in other words, knowledge of the stars and how the movement of the stars also pointed to changes in the seasons, climate cycles, local weather, those sorts of things. Simple things like being able to look up at the moon at night and seeing a ring of mist around the moon and knowing that, okay, there's going to be a dew tomorrow morning.
Yes.
We can collect the water in the desert, stuff like that. Superior sensory awareness, that was finely tuned to living in somewhat hazardous environments and needing to be finely tuned in order to, catch food to eat and that sort of thing. So working very closely with nature, living embedded in nature, being custodians of the land, sustainably and regeneratively interacting with the land, and having this inbuilt multidimensional awareness, in other words, a spiritual outlook on life, which made interdimensional communication an everyday occurrence. It was just as normal as talking to the physical person next to you. And what do those things look like in second tier? How do they show up? Some things that are definitely different in second tier is that the scale or scope of living and thinking is larger. So whereas in traditional older times you were focused on your tribal land and there were clear boundaries between you and the next bunch of folks living on their land, and certainly relating to the sun and the big night sky and those sorts of things. So there was a very big perspective in that sense. But in terms of the physical earth, it was a limited space. Whereas in second tier, here we are now leaving our planet and starting to travel through our solar system. We're getting early glimpses of our solar system from the outside and getting some rough idea of where we are in the galaxy and how we're transiting through the galaxy and those sorts of things. So that scale and scope is clearly bigger.
Well, just that we have a global perspective now, and pretty well everybody on the planet to one degree or other, most people on the planet arguably have some sort of global perspective emerging. So it's not just a local tribal or local land understanding of what you're talking about, but actually we're now starting to get that we're actually on this one planet together, and we actually need to be guardians and caretakers of the whole thing together.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
including outside of that into the solar system and beyond, as you're saying, because we're starting to explore those spaces.
Yeah. And also today we have the benefit of our science and technology. So all of the things that we've learnt through the scientific industrial revolutions and all of the interesting devices that we have now, which can show us where we are on the planet and who's winning the elections, all those sorts of interesting things.
Who's fiddling the elections?
Yeah.
Who's diddling and fiddling the elections?
Who's spying on us? Yeah.
Who's spying on us? Oh, exciting stuff.
Exactly. Well,
we did talk about those things as well on these shows, but not today.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing about the second octave, so second tier consciousness, is that we've gone from this pre-rational way of living in the early layers of first tier through the rational time, which really came with the agricultural revolution, and layer 4, layer 5 was maybe arguably the peak of rationalism in the scientific industrial era, and then layer 6 is still very much dominated by the rational mind, but trying to piece together the emotional, instinctive with the rational and come up with a combination which they're moving towards. Of course, as we leap into second tier, we get that consolidated, integrated, pre-rational, rational, trans-rational operation.
Yeah, that's great. That sort of early stages of integration of those parts are arguably also, I guess, the left and right brain. You could even say simply the hemispheres of our brains and our intelligence.
Exactly. Yeah. And I guess back in the early days, it was a pretty, like I said, a hazardous lifestyle, and not only because of the dangers of nature and living embedded in nature without any physical protection like we have now. We can hide ourselves in concrete boxes and that kind of stuff if it gets too wild. But also,
to a point. Well, I mean, the thing is, we are becoming right now with the fires, for example, and many other extreme weather events on the planet. We are becoming and realizing we are actually vulnerable. While we do have metal, steel boxes, concrete boxes we can hide in, we can't always do that.
That's right, and I think the extreme crisis that we're facing at the moment with the climate shifting and particularly going into this classical complex system change pattern of oscillating extremes,
yes,
extreme heat, extreme cold. We're starting, at least some of us are starting to realise that nature is fiercely in charge. Yeah. This idea that we need to do is just change our policy, we'll change the climate, it'll all be fine. I don't know about that.
Fiercely in charge like that. It reminds me of Ram Dass, who of course passed recently, who you wrote that wonderful book, Fierce Grace, because in a sense, perhaps that is what this is about, is it's a kind of fierce grace that has been visited upon the whole planet.
Yeah. And I think another significant thing that's changing as we move to this higher octave second tier way of living is that humanity is becoming peaceful, and we are moving beyond the point where we want to kill each other. And that was something that we had to cope with back in those earlier, or really right through the whole first tier of human consciousness. We've had to cope with this fact that, okay, some of us want to kill humans
for being different.
We want to battle over whatever, food,
yes,
property, land, money, and that's something we're moving beyond. So that is, I guess, a small concession as we move into second tier, is we are going to move beyond that need to want to kill each other. But yet, like I said, nature remains fiercely in charge, so we still have to deal with everything that nature brings.
Well, and I guess that part of that moving away from wanting to kill one another is there's going to be that more collaborative space, because we're going to have to deal with these larger issues that are coming about, and that's going to be very, very important if we're going to survive.
It is, absolutely. And that's one way that Freddie Silver's latest book is very useful and interesting, The Missing Lands, and I really recommend that book strongly. We're going to try and get Freddie on the show sometime. He's talking about a global scale catastrophe that happened around the time of what's known as the Younger Dryas, which was roughly around about 10,800 BC, where, as far as we can figure, a massive comet splintered and basically hit the Earth like a giant burning shotgun and set much of the planet on fire, and caused the great floods, which are recorded in pretty much every civilization's history.
Yes.
And wiped out our historical records. So we had to rebuild our history again. We don't have any written history that goes back beyond that.
It's fascinating on that topic that until this kind of work in recent times, the only record of that, of course, is in the Bible and the other texts there, which were essentially taken from these earlier records and re-mythologized and fitted into that space, that religious space. Arguably, some of you may not agree with that, of course. But,
yeah. And another interesting thing that's mentioned in Freddie's book, and which is also mentioned in Indigenous law, is open contact with star beings, extraterrestrial life, visiting planet Earth. And I first went to Australia's Red Centre back in 2012, and I had some interaction with a wonderful Aboriginal healer based in Alice Springs called Frank Ansell. And I was on an organised retreat, and Frank came and worked with us for a couple of days and took us around some significant sites in the East McDonnell Ranges. And at one of those places that we visited, we sort of stopped on this hill and looked over a dry creek bed and a bit of sort of deserty savannah kind of country, and he just said very casually, this is where my ancestors used to do their corroborees, which is like a ritual dance down in that flat there. And he said one night they were doing that, and then the Star people, they came and landed on that hill over there, and they walked down this way here and interacted with my ancestors, and then they left again. And he was just saying it like, it was, then a kangaroo hopped past, and it was kind of a normal thing. But if, Freddie's gone into great detail in his Missing Lands book to pull together all of the stories around the world, talking about interaction with extraterrestrials and their contribution to particularly rebuilding human civilization around the time of great catastrophes on the Earth, and there have been plenty. And we're just fortunate that we've been living through a relatively stable time on the planet, but it's not always like that. And also, there is definitely a movement as more and more of us shift into this transrational space, and particularly choosing to explore it using various means, one of which Mitch has made a movie about. What's that? Talking about psychedelics, DMT.
For those who don't know, Mitch is the creator and director of DMT, the spirit molecule.
In Japan, they call it that.
We could talk like this.
And people who have been exploring that place, many of them are reporting interdimensional interaction with intelligent life in other dimensions, some of whom are presenting as star beings from elsewhere in our galaxy or our universe. And this, of course, is still pretty much a fringe discussion in mainstream society, but all new breakthroughs are fringe things when they emerge, and this is the direction that we're headed. It's quite clear.
We'll take a break here on BFM. Thanks for your texts, of course, as usual, and we're familiar with probably see where we go. It's about the Ringing Cedars. Can you speak to the Russian influence? The Ringing Cedars series of writings by Vladimir Megre, inspired and directed by the Siberian woman known as Anastasia. We're all familiar with this book. I don't know if we want to make any comment about that.
I've got a feeling that Freddie mentions that in the Missing Lands. I mean, I'm certainly aware of it. I haven't gone into any great study of that particular body of work, but it certainly is very much aligned with many other sources that sort of tap into this deep indigenous knowledge and the multidimensional aspects of it, for sure.
You're resonating right now on Future Sense with Steve McDonald and Nick Jeans.
You're on Future Sense with Steve McDonald, Nick Jeans, and our guest Mitch Schultz here on this 20th of January 2020 today. In fact, it is better than 2020 vision.
And we're talking about the rebirth of Indigenous knowledge and how that ties into the emergence of second-tier consciousness according to Clare Graves' model of the evolution of humanity. And the fact that the shift into second-tier consciousness is being driven by increasing complexity, and particularly the increasing complexity of challenges that we face in the world, the compounding issues that are just building up and creating more and more tension, and the decline in the efficacy of our social systems, our government, and its failure to be able to address these very, very complex issues. And it's all of this tension that's actually going to flip our consciousness into a completely new octave of operation. And part of that will be the recurrence of Indigenous themes, and this is something that Clare Graves explicitly identified in his research, is that as we move into second-tier consciousness, some of the themes that we find in early stage human consciousness, Indigenous and traditional tribal living, are recurring, and they are recurring out of necessity, because we are faced with certain issues that require us to reconnect with and have a deeper understanding of this planet that we live on, and the wider influences that change and shape the cycles that we have to encounter, climate cycles and those sorts of things on the planet. So we were just talking a little bit about extraterrestrial communication and contact before we took a break just then, and this is something that is already occurring according to people who are exploring multidimensional communication, particularly through things like psychedelics. And it's still very much a kind of a fringe topic and weird to most people, but it's happening. And so let us imagine what a new way of living indigenously might look like through this second tier lens, second tier human values. So take all of those things that we mentioned earlier in this show about the nature of Indigenous living and supplement them with a grander perspective that includes, looking back on our own solar system's transit through this part of the galaxy as we have
about the
benefit of new technology in our Voyager spacecraft, which punched outside the sun's bow wave to give us a bit of information about interstellar space out there, and simple things like the falling away of fear as a driver of behaviour. So not that we don't feel fear anymore, but then fear just doesn't drive our behaviour. And the falling away of compulsion. So each of the first 6 value systems in the first tier of consciousness all come with particularly compulsive behaviours, and we're losing that. We're letting go of our compulsions, which makes us a more mindful and calmer species, less likely to kill each other too. Reawakening to multidimensional existence. So as we move beyond the control of the rational mind, not discarding it, but building another layer over the top of it, which gives us access to multidimensional information in a way that we haven't had before. And it also allows us to actively and practically merge the concepts of science and spirituality. And that's something that's a work in progress right now. You can see it happening this year.
I'm looking forward to this.
Sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
Indeed.
And also considerably expanded sensory perception. So as we've moved up through the layers in different ways, our sensory perception has expanded, and each time to adapt us to the particular life conditions that we face. So, you could go back to layer 1 and say, okay, there's a superior sensory awareness there for the particular set of life conditions of having to live bare skin embedded in nature, which arguably declined, although maybe certain parts of society, have preserved it through the ages. And as I mentioned before, one place where some of that knowledge has been preserved is in the military, for sure.
For all of you out there, strangers in a strange land, you're grokking Future Sense here on Bay FM.
You are tuned to Future Sense, and you're with myself, Nick Jeans, Steve McDonald, and Mitch Schultz here, and we're talking about Indigenous wisdom and moving forward into the future that is right here. It's here already, just not evenly distributed, as we often say here on this show. Yeah, Steve. Well, you want to talk a little bit about Uluru?
Yeah, just to quickly give a report on what we were doing out there. The reason we went was that we were guided to be there last weekend, and that information came through multiple interdimensional channels. So because this is a very new field that we're playing in in terms of our species, tapping into this trans-rational way of being and the various new information channels that it brings. So I'm being quite cautious and attempting to stay quite grounded, as we engage with these things, to make sure that we're not flipping back to the pre-rational and kind of filling in the gaps with fantasy or superstition and those sorts of things.
And that's an important point too.
It's a really important point during this transition time. So what I usually look for is multiple sources, independent sources, bringing the same information. And we certainly had that, and that's why I was quite confident that, okay, this is genuine, we need to go out there. And there was a predicted shift or upgrade in the geomagnetic energy around Uluru and Katajuda that was scheduled for last weekend. So it was definitely connected with that.
Who scheduled that?
we know that the Schumann resonance frequency has been increasing steadily, and sometimes in quite dramatic peaks. We saw peaks up to 99 hertz last year, whereas in the past it normally sits around 7.8 hertz, and that resonance, that frequency, is related to electrical storm activity in the Earth's atmosphere. And the change in it is most likely related to an increase or change in cosmic radiation that's impacting the planet, which I believe is probably connected to the fact that our solar system is currently transiting out of the local cloud, which is a particularly dense, cloudy part of the galaxy that we've been flying through for quite a long time.
And that is science. Yeah.
And that is science. There is science for that.
Yeah.
And
that's scheduled.
Cryon, who we regard as a reliable source because he's been predicting stuff for 30 years and it comes true. So Cryon seems to work, and Cryon's been talking recently about the need to think galactically and also about the presence of 24 nodes and nulls. That's his language on the planet. And if we look back through history, Nick, as you said, these energy lines that run through the Earth and around the Earth have been described in various ways through the various value systems throughout history, called various things from dragon lines to ley lines to the latest iteration seems to be nodes and nulls according to Cryon, and Uluru is said to be a node, an energy node, which is paired with an energy null, so that's like a masculine, feminine, the node being the masculine, and the feminine pair with Uluru is, according to Cryon, Mount Logan in the Yukon Territories in Canada. So when we got out there, all I can say is that I and many others in the group could quite clearly feel the energy flowing out of the western side of Uluru, and we just walked around the tourist circuit around the rock there. We did consult some Indigenous folks before we headed out there and got some guidance on protocol and those sorts of things. Yep. We also, discovered the depth of trauma that they've been through in terms of being shifted off that land and not having proper access to their sacred land and all those sorts of things. And it's a terrible, terrible tragedy, as it is in most places around Australia, and something that we as a nation need to heal and do something about urgently also. So when we did get out there, we explored as a group the interaction of our consciousness with this geomagnetic field that we discovered there. Quite a lot of us, if not all of us, were able to visualize the shape and geometries associated with the energy field, and also witness the upgrade which had been forecast. And we worked at Uluru one day, and then the next day, because of the weather out there, it's pretty hot, so we generally got up before dawn and went out and worked around dawn. And one day at Uluru and the next day at Katajuda, which is used to be called the Olgas. Exactly. And had some very, very interesting experiences and learn a bit about geomagnetic fields in the process.
Very good. Thanks for your text, and it was everything that Steve said. Yes, and Mitch, yes, yeah. We can just say yes. It's a good word. Yes, very good word. Yes. Sisi, texts. Thank you for all the texts, and we do have the draw running for the change code book. A copy of 6687 if you're a subscriber, or 043734 1119 on the text line. A couple of little points here. We won't be able to. Don't have time to address them deeply, but love to acknowledge what comes in. The Anunnaki from Nibiru, I feel, were the ones that were either on the meteorite that Steve mentioned earlier, or maybe, and we're talking about 10,800 years ago, as Freddie Silver in the Missing Lands book talks about, that maybe it was part of Nibiru that hit the Earth. They used to visit here every 360,000 years, according to this texter. They were mining the gold on Earth for their atmosphere on Nibiru. They also used to ingest the gold. Yes, and this is all part of Zachariah Sitchin's 12th Planet book series, yeah?
Yeah, I haven't read any of Zachariah Sitchin's books. I think he's interpreting some of the evidence in a mixed way. So I think some of the information, and probably most of the information in that text, is quite likely correct. But I must say, Freddie Silver has done the best job I've ever seen of pulling together the real, physical evidence, and also doing a lot of language analysis across different cultures, where this story is actually embedded in many, many more cultures than I expected right around the planet, of the great cataclysm, and then the response to that, and the presence of folks with advanced knowledge who had all sorts of extraordinary superhuman abilities, who were called in many, many different cultures Anunnaki or Anunnaki, which in all of these languages means people of the serpent.
Yes.
And the serpent being a representation, a form of expressing the presence of energy lines that run through the earth. And one of their characteristics was they had advanced knowledge of working with these natural energies.
Yes.
Yeah.
And on the notion of the snake, a texter has written in, it's a great text, and thank you so much for this. I don't know if we can address it very deeply right now, but someone has written in and said, asking for some magical level karma, clearing, healing, seriously. I killed a brown snake in an effort to protect my daughter. I felt soulfully so sad directly after, and then my life spiraled catastrophically soon after. Any thoughts? Yeah, strong text, and our empathy goes to you. Mm.
It is a strong text, and I think it's important to understand how our perspective on things can shape our experience of reality. And if we are feeling bad about doing something and we're coming down on ourselves, as a result, then that is going to shape our experience of life. It's going to shape what we resonate and what we draw towards ourselves. And the solution to that is forgiveness. So to that person that texted in, I would suggest that if you can truly forgive yourself and show compassion towards yourself in the same way that you probably showed compassion towards the snake, then I think that will make a difference for you.
Mm. And, you do the thing that you need to do in the moment. That seems to be the right thing to do in that moment. Absolutely. Last text quickly before we move on into the second part today. If there ever was a time for the mob all over the country to come in with a new governance, a new way dreaming, it's now, to take us through in unity to the new way forward. Yeah, that's good.
Might be happening.
Yeah, it's happening.
You've been listening to Future Sense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. Future Sense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.